Okay. Cool. Okay, so that is my normal way. I have an 8-page source sheet. But much of it is like really heavily, meaning it's all really heavily practical, but also I think a lot of these sources are just like really cool and really beautiful. So I'm very excited by our source material today. The second thing is just the like Shiva Home FAQ that Rabbi Wolkenfeld and I generated. We now send this out with Shiva announcements, but like if you haven't, the shear that we're going to do is from more about like, I'm a person who's experienced the loss, what should I do? And the Shiva Home FAQ is, my friend experienced the loss, how should I support my friend? So in that sense, these two documents are quite different. So I thought I would just give you both. Okay. So I just need a time thing that's not also going to buzz at me. So there's a tradition not to learn Hilchot Aveilut. Like the reason why people don't learn it until they have to go through it is because there's all sorts of, not just like superstition, like, oh, if I study this stuff, a relative of mine will die. That's certainly kind of out there, but also the sense that like, well, maybe there won't be death anymore by then, or maybe like the Messiah will come, maybe things like that. And it's the same reason why there's a concept of not teaching kids, like in most, like on Yom Kippur, if you have a child, you start to teach them about how to fast on Yom Kippur. We don't do that for Tisha B'Av. We don't teach, like a child on Tisha B'Av should like have a normal day. And the reason for that is because we hope that by the time that child reaches majority, the temple will be rebuilt and we won't need to have Tisha B'Av anymore. And so I just open up here with a quote from Rav Rabbanit, who talks about kind of the distinction between chinuch la'aveilut, educating towards Aveilut, when it comes to Tisha B'Av and mourning the temple, where like in some ways if you teach someone to mourn the temple, then what you're not doing is teaching them to pray for redemption. Like if you make it like it's normal, we mourn the temple, then you lose sight of the, well, maybe redemption could come tomorrow. Versus when you, like versus the death version of Aveilut, which that's kind of like the normal way of the world. And certainly some people think like when the Messiah comes, the dead will be resurrected, there won't be death anymore. Certainly you have that voice within Judaism, but Maimonides is an example of someone who doesn't think that's how it's going to happen. All the rationalists are like, but the planet would be massively overcrowded, things like that. So anyways, you have different ideas about kind of the future of death. And I'm sure doctors have lots to think about with that also. But anyway, so that's just by way of like a little bit of defense of the project. Okay, so with that, let's dive in. There's a whole timeline when it comes to mourning. So just I gave like a very brief overview of that at the top here. So the first thing is when a close relative of yours dies, which we'll talk about what constitutes a close relative in number 2. When a close relative dies, you become an onain, and that is the Torah has that type of mourn already. That is you are in that period when your relative is dead but not yet buried. And the whole purpose of that period is like do everything you can to get your relative buried as soon as possible. And also like your world is like broken. There's like an intense like raw brokenness at that moment. So we'll talk about the rules of that time period. But that's like the first status that you enter into is being an onain, or the status of aninut. Then after the burial you begin Shiva. So that the burial is day 1 of Shiva. So even if the burial ends at 3 p.m. and sunset is 5 p.m. or whatever it is, that is day 1. And then it goes for 7 days and it ends the morning of day 7. So it's like into the 7th day. Which means that sometimes people think like, wow, a whole week of welcoming all these people into my home and receiving condolences from them, that sounds so overwhelming. Between the day of the burial, the last day being truncated, Shabbat, where you're not really welcoming people in, Erev Shabbat, where it's only a part of a day, you really more like end up with kind of 3.5 days of welcoming a lot of people into your home. That's more typical. So if Shiva like feels really overwhelming, which sometimes people think it is, and it is overwhelming, and it's an overwhelming time in all sorts of different ways. It's a little bit like shorter, and I think people experience it as shorter than really 7 days. So that's Shiva. Shloshim is counted from the burial until the morning of the 30th day. Certain types of mourning end there, but if you're mourning for a parent, then you also observe Yud Ben Chodesh, 12 months, and that's from burial until one day prior to the date of burial. So we have, just as an example here, on a non-leap year, if burial was the 11th of Kislev, so then your 12 months would end on the 10th of Kislev the following year. The first yahrzeit, it's actually confusing. There's a debate whether the first yahrzeit should be the date of burial or the date of death. The second yahrzeit is for sure the date of death. But the first yahrzeit, especially in our world where it's very unusual for burial to kind of happen the date of death, you end up with this confusing thing where, so you can look at the example here, where you would have, so let's say the death was on the 8th of Kislev. If you waited for burial until the 11th, so your Yud Bet Chodesh would be observed on the 10th, but if yahrzeit is the date of death, then that's 2 days after the yahrzeit. Like your mourning period would extend 2 days past the first yahrzeit, which is kind of confusing and strange. So some people say that's what motivates some people to say the first yahrzeit is observed on a year after the date of burial instead of the date of death. But the custom is to observe yahrzeit on the date of death, even in the first year. The other thing I'll note is that if you have Shiva or Shloshim intersecting with a holiday or many holidays, so for example, if someone dies right before and is buried right before Yom Kippur, then Yom Kippur will interrupt their Shiva, and then their Shloshim will be terminated by Sukkot. So like in the span of a few days, you've like sped up all your 30 days. Like you basically have very little Shiva and very little Shloshim in that circumstance, just as an example. So holidays intersect with these dates in like kind of like perplexing and peculiar ways, but we're gonna move past that. But it's just worth noting, especially because at least community rabbis always say like people always die like right before the high holidays and right before Passover. I don't know whether that's like a true thing or whether that's like the experience of like, this is the busiest time in my calendar and I have 6 funerals. But that's kind of like in the field, that's what people say. I don't know. Here we don't have enough, thank God we don't have enough funerals here for us to really have an experience like that. I have many colleagues who do many more funerals than we do. Okay, so who do we observe all of these customs for? So we have 7 close relatives: father, mother, brother, sister, spouse, son, daughter. And brother or sister would include half-siblings, so you share one parent with this person, which is, I think sometimes people experience that as like kind of funny or strange. The Torah recognizes those relationships in all sorts of different contexts. You also can't like marry that person. And then the other times that this becomes complicated is when you have like, on the one hand, adoptive parents, like people who you want to mourn for, but maybe aren't technically in the world of like mourning requirements. And on the flip side, abusive parents who you maybe technically have these requirements for, but really don't want to fulfill them. So we're not going to go into either of those, but those are 2 like areas of family where it gets like tricky. And I think in our generation, I send this like in emails to people all the time, where we grow up with grandparents who are very active in our lives. Many of us have that privilege, and then they pass away, and it's like, well, I'm not a mourner, even though I just lost someone who I've been close to for 20, 30 odd years, of like as long as I can remember, and now I'm like not technically a mourner, and that can be a really hard thing for people also, that like sometimes it feels like, oh, these practices, they're like so constraining, and on the other hand, when you wish you had some way to like formally mark your loss and you don't have it, that's when that's in some ways when you realize like how brilliant this system is. Okay, so I mean, what I just, the like legal parts of what I just said are summarized in this Breita and Moed Katan. I think we're going to skip it, but that's basically where you have a list of the people who are like total level of relatives. And where we get it from is priests are not allowed to become impure, Kohanim are not allowed to become impure to the dead, except for these relatives. So these are the people who Kohanim are allowed to like be involved in their burial, and that's true still today, meaning typically if you're a Kohen, you would not go to a cemetery, but you would if it's one of these relatives. Is that clear? And it's like a funny way to learn something, but it's cool. Okay, so just some like practicalities. So God forbid, your parent passes away, whether that's in your home, in their home, in the hospital, in some other situation. So like really the first thing you want to do after making sure that they have in fact passed away, so meaning if you're not sure and they're in your home or something like that, you might want to first call an EMT or something like that. You want to like be sure that death has transpired. There's also some like legal documentation involved in that. That's actually like, that can get, I mean, when I did chaplaincy in New York, that was like a sticky thing that often happened where like they wouldn't let the Chaver Kadisha take the body out of the hospital until there was a death certificate, but the hospital was sometimes slow on generating death certificates. But they also needed the bed in the ward. So it would be this like difficult triangulation between like the Chaver Kadisha is like ready to roll, the hospital wants to move the body down to the morgue, the family doesn't want the body moved to the morgue, wants to give the body to the Chaver Kadisha, but they can't because the hospital hasn't generated a death certificate yet. So that was like just this complicated thing that the chaplains like in New York, at least at New York Presbyterian, worked hard to like sensitize the doctors to. I don't know, it might be different in different states also how that works and whether you're allowed to like take the body without a death certificate formally issued. I don't know, that was like a thing in New York. But anyways, the main people you want to call are funeral home. In most places there are multiple funeral homes, so it's like a good thing to know about your family, which funeral homes they like. Like I could tell you what funeral home my parents think is the best in Boston, and like that is like, when they reach 120, like that's who we're gonna call. These are conversations that are worth having. I mean, even before death, and again, like you should be giving this talk and not me, but it's worth having conversation with maybe exactly these relatives about like what their medical preferences would be, what their death-related preferences would be. And similarly, in terms of preparing, like Anshe Shalom owns a bunch of funeral plots, and we would be delighted to sell them to you. So if you want to make a plan for your own, demise at 120, we are here to help with that. But also it's better for your family not to, at this moment when there's now a death, to be like, I don't know what funeral home they would have wanted. I don't know where they would have wanted to be buried. Like, do they want to be buried in this place near Uncle Mo or in that place near Cousin Jack? Like those questions are best answered by the deceased themselves, who by the time they're deceased can't answer it anymore. So the more your family knows about your preferences, the easier this step will be. But if they don't, then all the relevant parties, usually the children, sometimes other people, have to figure out what funeral home. And the funeral home then will make arrangements with the Chaver Kadisha to pick up the body, perform a tara, which is a ritual washing of the body, and dress the body for burial in shrouds, and also make sure the body is protected. So once upon a time, guarding the body was about making sure literally like mice and rats didn't come and eat the body. In a modern morgue, that is not really a concern, which is why there are halachic authorities today who think that shmirah is not a necessity. Others say it is a necessity, and many funeral homes will lay out certain options relating to that, or will just like have it as a matter of course. Funeral homes charge for their services, by the way, like that's just like worth noting also. This is not like a free process, and that can be challenging, and there's also a lot of financial assistance in the Jewish community available for families who can't meet those prices. You also want a burial plot, so if there is one, amazing, and you should know where it is and who's in charge of it, and how to like get access to it. And if there isn't one, then purchasing one, which is again, like you're purchasing a piece of property in perpetuity, so there can be some like sticker shock associated with that. But again, like you're purchasing like a hunk of Chicago, right? So like that's why it's expensive. There are many funeral homes will give kind of options about shrouds and coffins. We can look at a source now actually about like a push towards simplicity in those things. And it's not that, oh, if I loved my relative, I would encase them in gold. That would be like the primary best way to show my love for my relative. That is not how we think about it. So if you turn the page, there's a source from Moed Katan 27b. It's like a really interesting source. So Barishonai Taut Adamit Kashel Krovav Yuter Mimitato. At first, burying the dead was more difficult for the relatives than the actual death. So much so that sometimes relatives would literally leave the deceased and run away because it was just so expensive and so overwhelming. Until Rabban Gamliel came, v'nahag kalut rosh ba'atzmo, and acted with frivolity vis-a-vis himself, meaning the Gamliels were extremely wealthy. They were the Nisim, they were the leaders of the community. They could have afforded the most fancy possible burial, and Rabbi Gamliel comes along and says, this is not good for our society, this is not good for the Jews, and I'm going to model what it should be. And he waived his dignity, and he gave instructions that he should be taken out for burial in simple linen garments. And people adopted this practice after him, to go out, to be taken out for burial in simple linen garments. Amar of Papa, Va'idna, Nahu, Ba'alma, Afilu, Betzorda, Bar Zuza. Nowadays, everyone follows this practice for taking out the dead in very simple things, and even like plain hemp garments that cost only a dinar. That would be like normal. And so we don't aim for like beauty or one-upmanship in the way that we bury. We aim for simplicity, for things that could be afforded equally by everyone. And so in America we can't bury without coffins, but coffins, simplicity, shrouds, simplicity. And so when given options, that's what we would encourage. Then the other thing you'll do is you'll set a date and a time for the funeral and the burial. It's a mitzvah to bury as quickly as possible. It's a mitzvah in the Torah. Where it comes from is like a little bit strange. The Torah talks about a person who the Beit has had to kill and then hangs, and then takes that hung person down that day and buries them immediately. And from that language of ki kavor tik baranu, you shall bury, like you shall bury swiftly. We interpret that all burial should happen as quickly as possible, and that it's a mitzvah. However, there are certain circumstances in which we delay. So, for example, if a person passes away, a person is niftar Friday afternoon, we don't bury on Shabbat just because it's a mitzvah to bury quickly. We don't bury on Yantiv. Once upon a time, possibly people did bury second at Yantiv, and I've heard rumors that in the Satmar community they still do this, but in our community that would be almost impossible to arrange and definitely unheard of. And the other thing we do is we delay in order to honor the deceased. So that would be making sure the funeral can be announced such that people can actually like come to it, making sure like if you live nearby where the deceased lived and where the burial will be, but you have a sibling who lives in, Timbuktu, like making sure there's time for that person to come in. Those would all be kind of reasonable reasons, but we don't say, oh, I think Sunday is a day when a lot of people will be able to come out, let's wait until Sunday. Like, we would not say that. We'd say, oh, how quickly can your brother in Timbuktu get here? Okay, amazing. If he can get here tomorrow, we're burying tomorrow afternoon. That's kind of what we would do. And the other thing is we only bury during the daytime. I mentioned Satmar before that they bury on second day Yantiv. They also bury, I've been to a Satmar nighttime funeral, but it's very unusual and we don't dig graves at night now in general. So, but in Jerusalem they do also. So you could see it at some point. The other thing you'll do, just in like the list of things that is on the to-do list, like when a person dies, find an officiant for the funeral, find individuals to deliver eulogies. It's become more and more common for like the direct mourners to deliver eulogies. It's not always the best idea. Like it could be the best idea. It could be that you'll have it together to like write something really that expresses what you want to say perfectly, and sometimes not. And there should not be like undue pressure on someone who's trying to like plan a funeral and deal with this tremendous loss to also come up with the right words to say. That person could be also the person who's officiating, that person could be a friend, that person could be a grandchild, whatever. There's like a lot, like it's important that there be eulogies. That's part of how we honor the dead, but it doesn't need to be you. And there's a lot going on, and that's okay. The other people that you'll select are pallbearers. This is like considered a great honor. In most Orthodox communities, this is only performed by Ben, for what it's worth. This is not like a halachic note, but just in terms of like practicalities, funerals are typically no longer than 45 minutes. So when you're thinking about like how many people to give eulogies, either few people, or if many people, then very short. That's kind of what people like expect when they show up to a funeral. Okay, so you've had this loss. The burial is planned for like 2 days from now. What are you right now? You're not an Avel. You're not a mourner yet. You're like an Onain. You're a person who's experienced this like acute loss. The Torah talks about this status when it talks about second tithe. So there's a type of tithe that you cannot eat when you're in this status, because second tithe you have to like go to Jerusalem and be happy while you're eating it. And so when you're an onain and you're really sad, you can't. And that would be like a Torah level violation. You can't eat sacrifices. So when Aaron's sons are killed, he doesn't eat the sacrifice. That's like, there's like a whole discussion about that. And the Mishnah Bikurim also talks about not bringing Bikurim while you're in Aninut. So the status itself is Torah level, but all of the ways that we observe it today are rabbinic. So this actually, like for those of you following along in Daf Yomi, there's been a lot of this kind of discussion about this exact status of a person who, the Talmud's language for it is like Misha Meitom Mutalafanav, someone whose deceased relative is laid out in front of him, because in Talmudic times it's not like the body was in the morgue or the body's at the hospital or the body's in the funeral home. Like, where's the body? The body's in your house until it's buried. So that's also when you have this like whole like public health kind of question related to that. So when you have this like close proximity to the body, what are your responsibilities vis-a-vis it, and what's your halachic status? So here's the Gemara. Misha meitom mutalafanav, someone whose deceased relative is laid out before him. Ochel b'bayit acher, he eats in another home. Ve'ino mesev ve'ochel, he doesn't recline while he's eating. Ve'ino ochel basar, he can't do anything celebratory. So he doesn't recline while he's eating, he doesn't eat meat. Eino shotei yain, he doesn't drink wine. But then also he has all of these exemptions from commandments, which is people describe this as being like extremely strange. Ein mevarich, ve'in mezamin, ve'in mevarchim lalav, ve'in mezamnin lalav. So he does not recite blessings before eating. He doesn't invite people to bench with him. Other people don't count him in their zimun. Upatur mikriyat shema, he doesn't have to say shema. Umina tefillah, umina tefillin, he doesn't say Shemona Esrei, and he doesn't like tefillin. Umikol mitzvot hamurot b'Torah. And from, this is like a wild statement, from all of the mitzvot mentioned in the Torah, this is understood to mean all of the positive mitzvot mentioned in the Torah. Meaning it's not like you're in the status, great, like go murder people. No. But also, like, you don't have permission to break Shabbat. Like anything that's a negative commandment, you're still observing. But positive commandments within reason. Meaning on Shabbat you also have positive commandments, but because it's a positive commandment attached to a negative commandment, the positive commandments of Shabbat apply also. But in general, it's like this incredible amount of like Jewish day-to-day life stuff that you've kind of stopped. Like, just like if you're a person who, like, every time you go to the bathroom, you come out of the bathroom and you say Asher Gatzar, like now you're going to go to the bathroom, come out of the bathroom and be like, and that's like a real, like...
But couldn't you if you chose to?
So it's actually a debate. Good question. I'm trying to... It's a debate between Rashi and Tosfot. So Rashi says, like you can if you choose to, and Tosfot says you cannot opt into positive mitzvot as in Onain. But that's exactly the right question. Okay, but so then the Gemara goes on here to talk about Shabbat and how Shabbat is different, and on Shabbat, for different reasons. Like, there's a general principle of Aveilut does not apply on Shabbat, but also your ability to prepare for the burial is very limited on Shabbat in general. So between those two reasons, Aninut status in public does not apply on Shabbat. However, things that you do in private, like maybe learning Torah or certainly having sex, those are things that you do not do. We're now on the practical summary on page 3 if you're following along. Those are things that you would still not do on Shabbat because those are morning practices that happen in private. So just to review from the start, so you can't eat in front of the dead, recline while eating, eat meat, drink wine. You're exempt from positive mitzvot mentioned in the Torah, including davening, bracha, kriyat shema. You have your debate, Rashi Tosfot, that we just described. Prohibited from tefillin, and in most circumstances that also includes the day of burial, and meaning that on the day of burial, even after the burial, let's say, again, our case is the burial is over at 3 p.m. and sunset's not until 5 p.m. If on a normal day, no death, a non-death day, it's 4 o'clock, rolls around 4 p.m., sunsets at 5, and you have not yet put on tefillin, and you are a person who's obligated in tefillin, then 4 p.m. you should put on your tefillin. Even if you were flying in the morning or something came up or whatever it was, or you had to run to work and then you davened at work but you didn't have your tefillin, or you didn't want to put your tefillin on at work, you should put on your tefillin. But if you were in Onain in the morning and then you had a burial, you would not then put on your tefillin that first day of mourning under most circumstances. Possibly if the beginning of your Aveilut was pushed off because of Yantev or something like that, then maybe you would, but most circumstances, no. You're not counted in a minyan, you're not counted in a zimun, you should not answer amin to other people's brachot. Also, super weird, just this reflex. We teach really little kids to say amin, and then you're supposed to not. So what it builds is this vacant, you have these little voids scattered throughout your day that I think is very purposeful. So what you should do would be wash Netzilat Yadayim without a bracha in the morning and before eating bread. You should observe laws of mourning that don't interfere with preparations for burial. This is a subject of debate, but it's typically the practice. So, for example, not leaving your home would probably interfere with your ability to make arrangements for the burial. So that would not be a thing that you need to observe. But you can refrain from washing, anointing, joyful things, greetings, haircuts, shaving, sex, work, Torah study. Those are all things that you can refrain. We'll go into all of that in greater detail when we get to Shiva. But all of those things are things you can refrain from, so that would come into effect right away. Say, that's more or less our practice, even though it's a little bit debated in the sources. You can wear leather shoes if you need to, and you do not yet sit low. That you wait until after the burial for. The Ashkenazi practice is to not recite Kaddish until burial, which makes sense because if you're not davening, but you're reciting Kaddish. I mean, there are other practices, but I think the Ashkenazi practice makes a lot of sense here. It's kind of you're gonna show up to minyan and not be counted in the minyan and just stand there and not daven. I know what it's so. I go to minyan every day and I'm not counted in the minyan, but I do daven with the minyan. So anyways, so you don't recite Kaddish until burial. And then we mentioned this before, but Aninut practices would not be observed in public on Shabbat or Yom Tov, but in private, this mourner wouldn't study Torah or have sex. They're also not called up for an aliyah. If they're a kohen, they wouldn't dachen. And weirdly enough, you also don't recite Havdalah. You just say Baruch Hamavdu Min Kodesh L'Chol after Shabbat. And then, so let's say, again, we described a case where that someone passes away on a Friday without time to bury before Shabbat. So you would, so after Shabbat, if you're a mourner for that person, you would not make Havdalah. But if the burial is then on Sunday after we'll see this in order, but on Sunday after the burial, you would make Havdalah then, which is just kind of strange. But kind of fits also with this we don't do mitzvah thing, which is like really a jarring piece of it. And I would also say like Aveilut practices, like this is a Torah level status that has tremendous kind of rabbinic expansions added to it, but because Aveilut is one of the main like casualties of people not studying Aveilut, because when you're in Aveilut, if you've never heard of this category, for example, getting guidance on like what halacha would apply to me right now feels a lot less urgent than how do I plan for the burial. So like I feel like these halachot are like under-observed even by observant people, because like no one teaches them, no one studies them, and then by the time they roll around, no one like sits you down and says like, okay, like here's what you're supposed to do. Even if like maybe someone should, that would be like probably a wise thing for people who professionally lead communities in Torah, that's what to do. But often it's like a very overwhelming time for people. So this is again like part of the argument for why you should take a moment while everyone's alive and healthy, please God, to kind of think through this moment in the life cycle. Okay, so just what to expect at the funeral and burial. So before the funeral, the family will gather, and whoever the officiant is will come in and help with this part of things, which is kriya, meaning tearing of clothing, and there's a blessing that we make, which is we say it whenever we say it without the name of God whenever we hear really like whenever we hear about someone else's death that we're not a mourner for, right? So when you hear about a death, you would say Baruch Dayan Emet. And when you are a mourner, so you say it with the name of God. You say Baruch Atah Hashem Elokeinu melech haolam dayan emet. And when you say it is typically at this junction, like before the funeral, the family gathers typically at the funeral home with the officiant of the funeral, and that's this moment. So what is it? So Kriya is another thing. Other non-Orthodox movements have kept this like tearing of clothing, but they've moved it onto a pin. Which is not how Halacha views this moment. So here's just some language from Moed Katan to kind of think about. It's very strong, I'm just warning you. Amar Rav Tachlifa bar Avimi Amar Shmuel. Rav Tachlifa bar Avimi says that Shmuel said, Avel shalo para v'shilo pirim chayav mita. A mourner who did not let his hair grow and did not rend his garments is liable to receive the death penalty. As it is stated by the death of Nadav and Avihu, Roshechem, right, this is the instructions that the other Kohanim were given, Roshechem, al tifrau bigdechem lo tifromu velo tamutu, right, so after Nadav and Avihu died, the other priests were told, like, you cannot mourn right now, and so how do you tell someone you're not allowed to mourn? You tell them, don't grow out your hair and don't tear your clothes, which means when it's time to mourn, you do grow out your hair and you do tear your clothes. We'll talk about hair later. So if they were not allowed to do these things, and if they did those things, they would be, right, the Torah says, or like Moshe tells them, like, and you will not die if you don't observe these. If you other Kohanim, siblings of Nadav and Avihu or whatever, cousins, you will die if you observe these mourning practices, meaning that if you are not in that situation, you must observe these mourning practices or else the same punishment would apply. It's a little bit like not perfect logic, I think, but that's really where I goes with it. We don't actually think that tearing your clothing is liable. Like if you don't do it, you get the death penalty. We don't think that. Like if there were a Beit here today, they would not like go around giving the death penalty to people who mourners who didn't tear their clothes. Medieval authorities actually mostly think that tearing your clothes is a rabbinic level mitzvah. The Ravid says it's a Torah level mitzvah, but in any event, it's you should do it on your own clothes. Clothes are the main thing. So the practicalities of that are as follows. You should wear a shirt that one would want to wear throughout the week of Shiva. And if in that week you decide, I don't want to wear this shirt anymore, then if you're mourning for your parents, when you put on another shirt, you have to tear that shirt too, for just that week. Kriya is performed, this tearing, you stand to perform it. So what customarily happens is everyone will stand. Another person, so this is usually again the officiant, will begin the tear, often using some kind of blade because clothes are made hardy these days. And then after there's like a little bit of a beginning of a tear, the mourner will recite the blessing of Dayan Ha'emet, and then the mourner will continue the tear themselves. So the tears happen differently depending on who you're mourning for. So if you're mourning for a parent, then it's the left side of the garment, beginning at the neckline, and you tear vertically all the way down to the heart. So it's like a pretty substantial tear. And you would tear any garment that you're wearing other than something like a sweater or a coat, and not underwear, like not like an undershirt or something, or like tzitzis or something like that. Tearing should be done by hand. For women, we typically say like, don't tear everything. Like there's like a modesty concern for women, so wear an undershirt, tear and pin it. Maybe for women, we do that sometimes. Things like that. In the death of a sibling, spouse, or child, you tear on the other side actually. So for a parent, it's on the left. For sibling, spouse, or child, it's on the right. And the tear doesn't have to go all the way down to the heart. It just needs to extend a hand's breadth, not that far. Which is a little bit less extreme. And it doesn't necessarily need to be all your clothing.
How does this work for like a man's suit jacket?
So men do tear their suit jackets.
Right.
That's
Like how would you go from the neckline to the heart? Because that's not really a place of the jacket.
So the way you normally tear in suit jackets is a really good question. Is you just tear down the lapel.
Down the lapel. Okay.
Yeah.
But the only way I've seen is like from the lapel in.
So that can also be, but that's not like the part that counts. Like people do like a horizontal tear and then a vertical tear. So I've seen both. Yeah. And suit jackets are especially hard. Like there you really need a blade to go like for a lot of it, because that's like, it's hard to tear a suit jacket because there's a lot like stuffing or whatever. I don't know, lining, whatever it's called. Suit jackets are hard to tear. But like very, common because you're wearing a suit jacket to your parents' funeral, so like you are then gonna tear your suit. Also, like common misconception, it doesn't need to be like your nicest suit that you're now about to destroy beyond repair. Like that is, I remember once someone said to me like, do I need to wear my best clothing for this? And the answer is like, no. You also don't need to wear black. That's like a very common thing that people do, but there's no halachic background for that. So you can, wear a blue suit that doesn't fit you very well or that you've worn for a long time and are gonna destroy. Like that would fulfill like the halachic obligation here. So that's another thing to just like point out, worth considering. It's not considered like more respectful to your parents to destroy like your most expensive suit. Yeah. Okay. So then you have the funeral. The funeral is like, it'll be run by an officiant and your preparation for it is done already. After the funeral, there's a mitzvah to escort the deceased. There's a lot of places where this gets discussed. It's like one of the primary like instantiations of V'ahavta l'reacha kamocha, of chesed, of like ways of showing kindness to our fellow. It's listed like Elud V'rim She'en Lahem Shiur. Like these are, right, we say it every morning with Birkot Torah. Like these are the things that there's no, you can't like do too much of that. Like as much of it as you can do. Okay, so but here's the Gemara from Brachot, Amar Chava, Amar Yehuda, Kol Roeh Mi Ve'ino Melaveu Over Mishum Lo L'Rash Cheref Osehu. This is in the daf also recently. One who sees the deceased taken to burial and doesn't escort him has committed a transgression due to the verse. He who mocks the poor blasphemes his creator. And if he escorts the dead, what is his reward? Amar Rav Asi says, he who gives to the poor gives a loan to the Lord, and the Lord will repay him. Okay, anyway, so on the one hand, it's a violation not to escort the dead. On the other hand, if you do it, there is reward, says the Gemara in Brachot. So this can happen at multiple times. So in in Boston, certainly, this is in New York, this is what I've seen. I've never seen it in Chicago, and I've been to a lot of funerals, that the custom is for them to put the coffin into the hearse, and then everyone on the street follows the hearse for like, I don't know, a little bit, like half a block maybe, something like that. And then people get into their cars and line up to follow in their cars to the cemetery. I've never seen that happen in Chicago. In Chicago, what I've seen is that at the cemetery, the people who made it to the cemetery then follow by foot from the hearse to where the plot is. So I guess it's just different customs, different places. The downside of the Chicago custom is that if you don't want to go to the cemetery, then you don't get to necessarily like follow the deceased in any way. And they don't really offer a way to like follow the deceased out of the funeral home. I don't know, it's kind of strange. Whatever, anyways. Okay, fine. So who does the burial? So now we're in the cemetery, we've followed the deceased by foot. For at least some of it, so who does the burial? So today, thank God, graves are dug by cemetery workers. They have this whole like amazing contraption that lowers the casket into the grave. The grave in Chicago is almost always involves a cement vault because of water levels and things like that. And what can happen, and you actually see this, like when we went to the old, what was it? I mean, whatever Entree Shalom used to be called, Merriam Pole, whatever, plot on the south side, they literally rise up, like the ground is extremely like bumpy and uneven because they didn't bury in these like weighted vaults that we use now that enable the ground to kind of stay flat. So they'll not only dig a hole, but they'll also put a vault, the bottom of the vault into the hole, and then after you put the casket in, they'll cover it, they'll lock it, they'll like put a top on it also that'll weigh it all down, and then that's when you start digging. So casket should be covered in earth by mourners and guests who are there, customarily just like two customs that are involved in this. You don't like hand the shovel to the next person, you like put the shovel into a pile of dirt, walk away, and the next person picks up the shovel, because it's not like, you're like sad to be performing this. So on the one hand, it's like a tremendous thing to do, and just this idea, like, at Rabbi Walkenfeld and I always leave funerals saying like, what a gift of our religion that we get to be buried by people who care about us and know us. And that's kind of like the way we like leave this earth. I think it's like a really beautiful thing. And on the other hand, it's like a really sad thing. So it's not like, here you go, like your turn. It's like, let me leave this here and you'll pick it up when you're ready and you'll take it. And then also, when you first pick up the shovel, you shovel with the back of the shovel first. There's another sign of, I wish I weren't doing this. So those are kind of two shoveling customs. And then after the burial is completed, or at least after like the casket is completely covered, or the vault is completely covered by dirt, there's some tefillot that are recited. The mourners recite a special kaddish called Kaddish de'ivchadata. It's the same kaddish that's recited at a siyum, strangely enough. I think those are the only two times you recite that particular kaddish, which is like interesting. And then what will happen is all the guests line up in two rows. This is called a shura, and this marks the transition from being involved in the burial to our attention going on to the mourners. So until the body has been buried, like the mourners are also everyone's focused on getting that burial, making the funeral happen, getting the burial to happen. And now at this juncture, while we're still in the cemetery, our attention completely shifts to the mourners, who now it is the community's job to cover it. So we make two lines, and as the mourners walk past you, you give them words of comfort, specifically, Hamakom Yinachim Etchem B'toch Sha'ar V'Leitzion B'Yerushalayim. May God comfort you amongst the mourners of Zion and Jerusalem. And this is like, I always find the Shura like extremely powerful. Like it's just this really strong image of the community offering comfort in this moment and like changing all of our attention. Like 1 second ago we were like sweaty and dirty and like doing all this thing, and now we're like in these like nice kind of organized lines, focusing our attention on the mourners and on the family. And I think I just love the kind of like the way it the kind of like dramatization of that feeling of that transition. I think it's like one of those things that Jews just do well. Okay, so then you're beginning, now you, the mourner, are beginning Shiva. So first of all, you woke up in the morning and you didn't say brachot. So you're going to first catch up on brachot. You're going to say Birkot Torah. If it's the afternoon, then possibly the time for Birkot Shachar has passed. But if you normally say the Shalosh Ani brachot, you should say them then. You should make a blessing on your tzitzit if that is relevant for you. If you missed the Havdalah and it's not too far into the week, then you should say Havdalah at that point. If the funeral was in the morning and it's still time that you can daven shacharis, then you should daven shacharis now. No, without tefillin. Because the first day of, we're about to see this in a second, but the first day of Shiva has a different status from the rest of Shiva. So the rest of Shiva, past the first day, the mourner wears tefillin, and on the first day, the mourner does not wear tefillin. And the first day has this like unique, the halacha has the sense, the first day, I'll just like skip to it verbally. The first day has a unique status. It's possibly a deoraita, like a Torah level obligation the first day of Aveilut. The rest of it is not. And second of all, the halacha just sees it as like, this is like the hardest of the days, like emotionally the hardest of the days, and therefore it'd be inappropriate to wear tefillin, not because of any, not because you don't do mitzvot asay, like you do at this point, mitzvot apply, but because tefillin have this grandeur to them. Tefillin are called a pe'er, which is the same reason why you don't wear them on Shabbat, because on Shabbat you already, I guess it's different, tefillin are an oat and Shabbat is an oat, but it's the same reason why you don't wear them at other times, is because tefillin have like a certain glory to them, and the sense is that glory would not be appropriate for a mourner on this day. So, yeah. So tefillin end up being like this kind of separate category from other mitzvot. So the other thing, I don't think I actually have it on here, but before you do any of that, you should wash your hands. And also whoever leaves the cemetery should do Nesilat Yadayim without a bracha, but you just, you wash. And then at home you have Sudat Havra, and that's just the first meal. In our community, thank God, this is like the mitzvah that ASBI is by far the best at. We're really good at feeding people. So Sudat Havra is Havra means, if you look at like the second of these sources from Shmuel Bet, 2 Samuel, Ve'avo kol ha'am lehavrot et David lechem ba'od hayom. All the troops came to urge David to eat. That's the verb lehavrot. So a sudat havra'ah is the meal in which we like urge other people to eat, which is just like the most like Jewy thing you can possibly imagine. And but also the custom for that meal is that it should not be your own food. So if you look at the source that we skipped, you have Amar Vida Marav, Avel Yom Rishon Asur Lechol Lechem Mishalo. A mourner on the first day cannot eat food from his own. You have a citation from Ezekiel, and then the Gemara says, Rava v'Rav Yosef machlefei seudatayhu lahadade. So Rava and Rav Yosef were in mourning at the same time, and they exchanged meals with each other. Like you can't eat your own food, but you can eat the other mourner's food, so they just let like swap. Now I think it's like really normal in the Jewish community. We provide food for like the whole of Shiva, but particularly this meal. It's very important that the community provides for people. Did you have a question? No? Okay. Cool. Oh, and then what do you eat? So this is just like a cute little thing. This third source here from Bava Batra is that it imagines that the lentil stew that Jacob was preparing when Esau comes in, and Esau's really hungry, and then Jacob buys the birthright. So the Gemara here is imagining that what is the point of that lentil stew? Well, that it was the day that Abraham had died, and the lentil stew was meant to give comfort to Isaac. And then the Gemara says, well, how do lentils give comfort? So there's two different opinions. A lentil has no mouth, so to a mourner has no mouth. Like a lentil doesn't have, like imagine a chickpea, it has a crack. But a lentil doesn't have a crack the way a chickpea does. So to a mourner, has no mouth, meaning a mourner, so like the lentil just is representative of the mourner. And alternatively, a lentil is round, and so mourning comes around to the inhabitants of the world. So what part of what it does is it reminds you of like the circularity of life. So that's just like a really cool source. But anyway, so lentils are still the custom, round foods in general. Bagels are often another round food that people eat at this. Eggs, hard-boiled eggs, another thing. So those are kind of classic ones. Okay, so now morning practices during Shiva. I think we're mostly out of time. Okay, we'll run through this really quickly, and I'll just point out some important things. So Ben, you asked before about the first, or about tefillin, and where I landed to in that is that the first day is different. So that's this first citation from the Rambam where he says, mitzvah aseli tabel al hakrovim, it's a positive commandment to mourn for one's closest relatives. Shneamar, okay, whatever, there's a citation. Ve'in aveilut mina Torah ela biyom rishon bilvad. But the mourning is not a Torah level mourning except for the first day. And what the Rambam explains as the first day is Yom HaMita v'Yom HaKvura. So I think the Rambam is hoping that the day of death and the day of burial are the same day. That is very unusual for us now, but so we interpret this to mean that the day of burial is the like Torah level obligation in Aveilut day. And then he says, "Well, Shar HaShaviyamim Eino Din Torah." The rest of, because he says explicitly, the rest of Shiva is not Torah level. Which, just to put into perspective, like I think this is just like a really important concept because a lot of people like go crazy about mourning practices in a way that they don't about like Shabbat or something like that, right? Whereas like Shabbat, every little thing is a Torah level commandment, and for mourning, so little of it is actually Torah level. Like we said, like an onin can't eat second tithe. That would be a Torah level violation, but every other part of Aveilut is rabbinic. The first day of Aveilut is Torah level, everything after that is rabbinic. Like it's just like to understand like the level of obligation that we're talking about here. Last week when we were talking about Nida, everything was like, this is a prohibition on the level of Yom Kippur, where like on Yom Kippur if you eat you get karet, and if a husband and wife have sex when they're Nida, then they get karet. Like that is not the level of thing we're talking about with Aveilut. So even though these are beautiful halachot and they're serious halachot and we observe them with a lot of seriousness, like it is important to kind of understand that like if there's something in Aveilut that's like really, really hard, we're talking about a much lower level of obligation than we are in many other areas of halacha. So that's just like worth like knowing and understanding. Okay, so just to dive into the prohibitions on that apply to a person who's sitting Shiva. So I'm just going to run through the practical rundown and you'll just trust me that the Rambam listed all of these things in the second source there. Okay, so hair cutting, this includes shaving and actually nail cutting, interestingly enough, but you can comb your hair and you can cut your nails, but you can't use like clippers or scissors or anything made for that. So if you want to bite your nails, you can, or like tear your nails, you can, but you can't use any device to effectuate that. Laundering, so we don't, this might be familiar from like the 9 days. You shouldn't wear laundered clothing and you should definitely not do laundry during Shiva. This does not include underwear or socks. You can wear clean underwear, clean socks. Anything that's meant to like absorb sweat, you can wear clean. And you can also wear clean clothing on Shabbat according to most opinions. Bathing, so this prohibition is exclusive to pleasure. So we don't bathe for pleasure. You can remove dirt or perspiration, or if you need to bathe for medical reasons. If you really, really can't handle not showering, then you can shower in lukewarm water. A woman who's mourning shouldn't use the mikvah, by the way. That's like an interesting thing. But if your husband is mourning, then you can use the mikvah. And that's kind of, and you'd be surprised by that because you're not allowed to have sex. But you can use the mikvah when your husband's in mourning. Makeup is prohibited during Shiva, but medical lotions, anything you're using for dry skin, and deodorant are all, yes, permitted. Or I'm at the top of page 7 now if you're following along at home. Sex is prohibited, but other harchakot, distancings that we observe during Nida, like not sharing a bed, like not hugging or kissing, all that stuff is all permitted. So it's just sex that's prohibited. Everything else is okay. And that's like a really good idea because like your spouse probably needs a hug. So that we can like feel like makes a lot of sense. Shoes. So if you are ill or you have a foot injury that requires you to wear leather shoes, then you can wear leather shoes. But otherwise not. You often see mourners kind of like not wearing shoes when they're home, but they don't need to do that, but I think it's just comfortable. It is customary to wear non-leather shoes even to the funeral, or like if when you get into the car after the burial, you would take off your leather shoes. So that's kind of a thing, meaning like if you're gonna wear a suit but not wear leather shoes, like that's sort of, you do that like once a year on Yom Kippur probably. Like that's kind of weird. So that's just a thing to consider in preparing for the burial. Mourners are not permitted to work, so much so that a business owned by a mourner should either be closed, or if a mourner is a co-owner in a business, he should sell his share of the business. And that's something that you should prepare for even before the burial. That's like a pretty serious thing. The only kind of work that is permitted is household chores like cooking, cleaning. Torah study. So Torah study is interesting because on Tisha B'Av, there's certain parts of the Torah that you can study. So you can study like the sad parts of Yirmiyahu. You can obviously study the book of Eicha. So the question is whether a mourner is permitted to study those same things. And there's a lot actually of debate on this subject. You can definitely recite, what I can say for sure is that you can recite the portions of Torah that are included in Tefillah. But there is debate about some of the portions of Torah that you say like before Tefillah really starts. So do we say the part of the Torah that talks about the part of the Mishnah that talks about the Korban Tamid? Do we say that like all of that kind of stuff, like all the Korbanot stuff, like what of that yes, what of that no? That gets debated a little bit. Fine. Okay, so there used to be a practice that when someone in the house was a mourner, you would flip over every bed in the house. This was an amazing practice in the sense that it very explicitly symbolized like the world has turned upside down. This is no longer practiced in any which way. Possibly covering of mirrors is an instantiation of the flipping over of the beds. There's some like literature to that effect. Our beds, like you can't really turn them over. Like turning over your mattress like is a thing you are, I think, theoretically supposed to do every so often anyways. But like it wouldn't like effectuate what they're trying to get at with them. There's like some scholarship about like what their beds look like and what it means to turn over a bed and blah blah blah. Anyways, we don't do this. But this is also the source for sitting on a low stool. However, if you can't sit on a low stool because you're elderly or because it's really uncomfortable for you, perhaps you're pregnant, then you can sit in a regular chair. There used to be a practice of wrapping your head like this, but like for men also, and that even the Tosfot talk about people are no longer doing this. We think that the Gentiles will laugh at us, or they'll think that we're sorcerers or something like that. So that also like disappeared a while ago, even though it's described in the Talmud. The Aruch HaShulchan says you should wear your hat, your Shabbos hat, for example. You should wear it like low over your face for all the days, because the idea in the head wrapping is also that kind of works like blinders almost. So like this is not a great example, but like it's meant to like just like narrow your vision a little bit, like focus in on your feelings and like what you're doing right now while you're sitting Shiva. So anyways, so the Aruch HaShulchan thinks you should like wear your hat low. Greetings. This one is a big one. Mourners shouldn't greet others and other people should not greet them, which is like kind of awkward. You show up to a Shiva home and you just say like, you don't say anything, you just sit down quietly. Certainly you want to avoid any usage of the word shalom for a number of different reasons, and all debate. It's like a really beautiful, after the Pittsburgh massacre, I gave a shiur about this specifically, if you want to check that out. I'm really like into this area of Halacha. If greeted, then if it's after the first 3 days, so like burial day 2, day 3, so on day 4, then you can, the sense is like after, there's like a turning point mid-Shiva in Halacha a little bit, and this is like one of the instantiations of it, which is that after like the halfway point, there's something like a little bit easier. And this actually is kind of like true. Also, there are people who sort of suggest like if you're visiting, if you're making a Shiva call, like if you're a really good friend, go with the first half of Shiva, and if you're like a less good friend, go with the second half of Shiva. And that's like not a halachic advice. That's like practical advice. Like it's just easier in the second half. But halacha does recognize that, and it gets carried out here. So if on day 4 someone comes in and says, hello, you can say hello back, which you couldn't do previously. The Rama extends this also to gift giving, even including mishloach manot. That if someone's sitting Shiva, you should not give them mishloach manot. There's also a custom for the mourner to not leave their house for all of Shiva. This is like a little bit, this is a custom. So meaning you'll see very frequently, Shiva will be sat in Indianapolis for days 1, 2, and 3, and in Chicago for days 4, 5, 6, and 7. Like that's very common today. There's nothing wrong with that. But obviously to get from Indianapolis to Chicago, you must have left your home. Just as an example, I don't know, unless you have like a really truly Jaimundo home. But things like that you'll see very commonly, or like we're all gonna sit Shiva in this place, but really like this sibling lives in Deerfield and this sibling lives there, but we're all sitting Shiva like together. That's another really common thing, and clearly if you're like sleeping at your home in Deerfield but you're sitting Shiva in Skokie, then you have driven to get to where you're sitting Shiva, and like that also happens. But like it's not like, oh, I need milk, let me go to the store and get milk. Like it's all like for the purposes of the Shiva that you would be leaving the house. And it is, I mean, for those, like, my father sat Shiva in our home twice for each of his parents, and it's like quite serious, like not to leave your home for that long. It's like, and you leave your home on Shabbos. But then what happens is at the end of Shiva, I'm skipping the house customs for a second, what happens is at the end of Shiva, after the morning of the 7th day, you then like leave your home, and that's actually like a big moment to kind of just like walk around the block. You certainly like during Shiva would not leave your home like for exercise. So now you're like, oh, like welcome back into the world. And that's like a real moment of like, I've been in this cocoon, and now I'm leaving it. And so it really like marks it if you've taken the cocoon seriously. And I have to say, like, there's something so important about Shiva. Like, you hear from people, or you see it even like in the workplace, like, oh yeah, my father died yesterday, and now you're back at work. And there's something like very perverse about that. No matter what your relationship was with your father, frankly. Like, even if it was terrible, like, take a day, like take 7 days, like take a beat, and like hold that loss, because otherwise it's gonna like go somewhere else, and that's gonna be bad. So both like the taking of Shiva seriously, even though, as we mentioned, most of it's not Torah level, but then also the like transitioning carefully from Shiva back into life is also like a big moment. We skipped just like a few little bullet points here about home customs during Shiva. The funeral home usually provides a Shiva candle. It burns for 7 days. You just light it in the space where you're sitting Shiva, just a custom, but a very nice one. We have this idea that like flames represent souls, and so that's the whole idea behind Yahrzeit candles, Shiva candles, all of that, and I think there's something really to it. Like there's something very alive about a flame, and that. So anyway, so it represents the soul of the deceased. It's customary to cover mirrors, or like turn them around or something. Daily services are ideally held in the house of mourning. And there's all sorts of small changes to tefillah, so we don't say tachanun, for example. And after the burial, that's when the mourner begins to recite Kaddish. And if that's appropriate, then the mourner also potentially leads services if the mourner can lead services, and if they're a man or whatever. Okay. We talked about the end of Shiva. I think I'm gonna end here. I just gave you, the rest of this is all just like notes, because I felt like I can't just leave it here, but I knew I wasn't really gonna get to it. So if you wanna read about Shloshim, 12 months, Yahrzeit, and Yizkor, you have stuff here. Bibliography, one note, that last book in Hebrew, Nathan, this is really just for you. Rabbi Greenwald, he is writing like the best Aveilut Sefer in Columbus, Ohio. And you can, I can send you this, and I'll send you a link for it. Like the hyperlink that appears on this printed piece of paper is not clickable, but it's on Hebrew Books. And it's just like a truly amazing work of halachic scholarship, and it comes from the United States, which is like really cool. And he published in English, I think, under Leopold Greenwald also. And it's full of like really interesting things. Just the one thing that I'll just point out, that after Shiva, like during Shiva, you don't have questions, like you occasionally will have questions, like there's a whole fascinating sugya of like, you're sitting Shiva, but it's also your son's bris. things like that. Or like you're sitting Shiva, but you got married yesterday, like or whatever. Like those, like the Talmud loves these like confluence of happiness and sadness. So, but for the most part, most people who are sitting Shiva don't have these questions of like, should I go to this wedding? Should I, my friend is making a siyum on the full Daf Yomi cycle, can I go to that? But those questions immediately after Shiva start to become really real. And so that area of Hilchot Aveilut is by far the most complicated because the texts starting from the Talmud are really, really difficult. And then the Rishonim interpret the Talmud in diametrically opposed ways and come to diametrically different understandings of them. And then let alone the types of entertainment and fun that people are pursuing have like really changed over time. So all of that leads to like, it's really complicated. And so I gave some kind of like basic guidelines, but again, like if this happens in your life, Rahman al-Tzlan, and you're, you know, in Aveilut and you're in Shloshim or you're Bet Chodesh, I should mention Shloshim, if you, for the loss of a non-parent, at the end of Shloshim is the end of your like mourning practices. There's nothing after that until Yartzeit. But for a parent, you have this whole 12-month period, and these like happiness restrictions apply that whole time. And those are some of the most kind of like live ones that people are making decisions about, and they're really quite complicated. So you'll hear lots of different things in the type of guidance that people give, and the type of practices that people choose. It's important in the sense that you carry the sadness with you for a whole year. And halachically, like the question of whether you should like use a sponge or not on Shabbos is like a higher stakes question than this. So that's like the what you're holding when dealing with these questions. And so they're important, but also like there are and have developed over time certain leniencies for certain things. But also a lot of mourners really like taking this very seriously. Meaning, I could tell you like Rav Soloveitchik thought any music that you listen to that doesn't make you want to get up and dance is fine. And a lot of mourners choose to not listen to any music at all for 12 months because that is how they want to mark this. And so like both of those are good and real and like wonderful ways to live out this period. So it's complicated, and you should seek guidance when that happens. Which please God it won't. Okay, we're gonna be finished. Thank you for coming, and may we not know such things.